Hello and welcome back to Principles of Microeconomics with James Bland. This class has got the rather long title of It Doesn't Matter Which Side of the Market the Government Taxes. That's the end game of what I'd like you to understand by the end of this video. But let's make a start by going through another of these silly stick figure diagrams. Okay, so whenever there's a trade in the market, there is a buyer, a seller, and in our previous two videos, we also had this third entity in here called the government. Okay. And so when a trade happens, the seller sends a good to the buyer. The buyer sends money to the seller. And then depending on whether we are taxing or whether the government is taxing either the buyer or the seller's side, either the government taxes the buyers, so for every item the buyer buys, they send some tax to the government, or for every item the seller sells, they send some tax to the government. And in some cases, like payroll tax, both of these happen at the same time. Okay, so this is the situation that we're trying to model at the moment. Let's have a think about the things that the buyer cares about and the things that the seller cares about and how they're related to each other. Okay, so if you are in a market and you are a buyer, the question you should be asking yourself is, if you're going to buy an item, is what is my marginal value? And how much do I have to give up to get it? Okay, so if we have a tax on buyers, then the price consumers pay is going to be equal to the price sellers receive plus the tax. Okay, so what they're caring about is the combination of how much the seller gets and how much tax they have to pay. They don't really care how much of this the government gets and how much the seller gets. I mean, maybe you might have some preferences over that, but in a Principles of Micro course, we're assuming that all the buyer cares about is how much money they have to give up. What the buyer cares about here is the combination. Okay, and what they're doing is they're comparing this to their marginal value of the item. And so they're going to buy if the price that they have to pay, the price consumers pay, is less than or equal to the marginal value. Okay, now let's put ourselves in the shoes of a seller. Sellers have a marginal cost, and they're going to sell that item if their marginal cost is less than or equal to the price that they receive, which is the price sellers receive here. That's this notation. Okay, and so the thing the sellers are going to be paying attention to is how much money do they get to keep. If they collect $10 but have to send $1 to the government, they really only care about the $9. Okay, the seller would be indifferent between collecting $9 and sending $1 to the government, or collecting $9 and sending $100 to the government. Either way, they end up with $9. Okay, so really the things that are going to pin down supply and demand is we need to find the quantity such that quantity demanded at the price consumers pay is equal to quantity supplied at the price sellers receive. Okay, so let's see what this looks like on a supply and demand diagram. Okay, here's supply, here's demand, and suppose instead of working out what happens if we impose a tax, this time we are going to work out, well, if we wanted to tax a market such that we got a particular quantity, how much would we have to tax it? Okay, so here's our original equilibrium quantity without a tax, and we can't increase quantity beyond here, but suppose we wanted to achieve this quantity in the market. Well, there could be two ways we could do this with taxes. Okay, we could impose a tax on buyers to shift the demand curve so it intersected with this part of the supply curve, right? So it would look something like this. So this would be demand minus a tax. Okay. Alternatively, we could shift the supply curve so it intersected with this part of the demand curve. So here we'd have supply plus tax. Okay, but in both of these diagrams, I just have to find another color here. In both of these diagrams, what we're going to have here is this price will always be the price the sellers receive, and the price that's intersecting with the original demand curve is going to be the price that consumers pay. Okay, and the reason for that is that if we impose a tax on the demand side, that's my red, then the demand curve is going to shift down by the value of the tax. And if we impose a tax on the supply side, then the supply curve is going to shift up by the value of the tax. Okay. And so, since we have these two equations telling us that if we impose a tax on the supply side, we have price the sellers receive is equal to price consumers pay plus the tax, and if we impose a tax on the consumer's side, then the price consumers pay is equal to the price sellers receive minus the tax. These two equations are the same because I can get to the second equation by just subtracting tax from both sides of this equation. Okay, so what we, in working out what's going to happen to a market if we tax it, we don't really need to know which side of the market is being taxed. Okay, and the reason for that is that no matter which side of the market that is being taxed, the difference between the original supply and demand curves at the quantity that we're going to be trading at after the tax is going to be equal to the tax, right? So here we have price consumers pay is equal to the price sellers receive minus the tax, or alternatively, the price sellers receive is equal to the price consumers pay plus the tax. Okay. Let's just redraw this with as little mess on here as possible. My original supply curve, my initial demand curve. here is my initial quantity. And if I impose a tax, then it's going to pin down a quantity such that the difference in heights between the supply and demand curve are just equal to the tax. Right, so here's the price consumers pay, here's the price sellers receive, and the tax is how much the government collects. If you think about this, these numbers have to add up, right? The consumer pays PC, and then the producer receives PS, and the government receives T. So those numbers have to add up. Okay, so the result we're getting here is that it does not matter whether the government taxes supply or demand. Okay, so you should have a think about this in terms of things like sales tax. In the US, sales tax is something that is explicitly assessed on the buyer, right? You show up to the store, you see a sticker price of $10, then you go up and you actually end up spending $10.80. To be honest, as an Australian, this is something that took me quite a while to get used to. In Australia, tax is included in the sticker price, so when I see a price of $10 in Australia, I know that if I pull out a $10 bill from my wallet, that's going to be enough to pay for it. Okay, but sort of more importantly, what I want you to think about here is that according to our simple model of supply and demand, it doesn't matter whether the government taxes the supply or the demand side of the market, but there might be some reasons outside of this simple model that it might be a better or worse idea to tax supply or demand. And one of the big reasons for thinking about this might be the administrative burden. Administrative burden. Okay, it might be a lot cheaper to tax one side of the market than the other. For example, if you have a small number of sellers and a large number of buyers, it might be easier to make sure that sellers are collecting the right amount of tax and helping them to collect that tax, rather than to make sure that buyers are collecting the right amount of tax. Furthermore, and this is where I'm starting to editorialize, I think it's much easier for sellers who are operating with computerized cash registers and things to calculate the tax and impose it on their stickers than it is for consumers to work out what the local sales tax is, which varies by county in Ohio, for example, to work out how much they're actually going to pay. So by taxing sales, say, on the seller's side rather than the consumer's side, this may remove quite a lot of cognitive load for people trying to work out how much they are actually going to pay for particular goods. Okay, so what I want you to remember here is that our model is saying that it doesn't matter which side of the market the government taxes, the outcome is going to be the same. And by the outcome, I mean we get the same quantity traded, and we get the same price consumers pay and the same price sellers receive, and also the same tax revenue either way. But there might be some things outside of the model that mean that taxing a particular side of the market is a better idea than taxing the other. Okay, so we have a simple model. It is very useful to make some derivations and understanding what's going on, but also remember that there are a lot of things that we're not modeling here, and so there might actually be some very good reasons why one side of the market is taxed and not another. It just hasn't got anything to do with the picture I've shown you today. Okay, thank you very much. I'm James Bland, and I'll see you later.